War is not the continuation of policy by another means. The world would be a simpler place to understand if this dictum of Clausewitz were true. Clausewitz, a Prussian veteran of the Napoleonic Wars who used his years of retirement to compose what was destined to become the most famous book on war, called On War, ever written. He actually wrote that war is the continuation of political intercourse, dies politischen Verkehrs, with the intermixing of other means, mit Einmischung anderer Mittel. The original German expresses a more subtle and complex idea than the English words in which it is so frequently quoted. In either form, however, Clausewitz's thought is incomplete. It implies the existence of state interests, and of rational calculation about how they may be achieved. Yet war antedates the state, diplomacy, and strategy by many millennia. Warfare is almost as old as man himself and reaches into the most secret places of the human heart, places where self dissolves rational purpose, where pride reigns, where emotion is paramount, where instinct is king. Man is a political animal, said Aristotle. Clausewitz, a child of Aristotle, went no further than to say that a political animal is a war making animal. Neither dared confront the thought that man is a thinking animal in whom an intellect directs the urge to hunt and the ability to kill. That is the opening lines of the first chapter, or the first chapter of this book called A History of Warfare by John Keegan, one that I've started reading recently and has been another worthy addition to the library if we're just going to count the first chapters. He goes so far to address some of the ways that our very famous von Clausewitz is presented in this community or in the world at large, as well as address some of his ideas and how he came to believe them. An important distinction that we want to continue to make on this show and in our community and in our culture is that there is a difference between tracking the history of a subject and the application of a subject. If I'm going to look at the history of, say, an automobile, I may look at how a car came to be, and you had early engines or buggies, and you had all these different ways on how the car came to pass. And then we saw different developments in transmission technology, steering capabilities, and so on and so forth. But that is different than arguing about how to, or not even arguing, that is different than the practice of making a Lamborghini. A Lamborghini may point back to the history and value of ways that cars have been made in the past, but that is not the same thing as building the machine. In fact, history in this case may be an example for teaching us how we might think about a subject, but it is not the same. Studying the history of a subject is not the same thing as doing the work of understanding the ethical constraints of our environment. So, if that was going to sound like a contradiction, let me paint a story for you. Let me paint human history in a sort of narrative that challenges the way that we think about war and also drives home the imperative that rests before us. The history of warfare, as depicted by film and in some ways by novels, is this classical approach of pre modern, medieval, the modern era, and our postmodern era. And this applies to both a historical account of the West as well as distinct and major shifts in public philosophy from time to time. But the pre-modern world is oftentimes separated from from antiquity by, well, conveniently, the birth of Jesus or the life of Jesus, but a shift in calendar structure as well as what we look at society. But also, there's a problem because the Dark Ages weren't really considered the Dark Ages until somebody else came around and decided to call them the Dark Ages. It wasn't the same thing. It wasn't exactly as cut and dry as we look at it. But in these phases, this pre-modern, modern, and postmodern eras, pre-modern being before the Enlightenment, modern being the Enlightenment era from the Renaissance to the early 1900s, and then postmodern would be 1900s to contemporary our contemporary time. We also see a shift in how people talked about and expressed the proper application of war. And this is why I think there's an important reason to distinguish between the medieval time and antiquity, because what we are seeing in this historical timeline is a shift in general perceptions on what you and I would refer to as the rules of engagement, or the right way, the moral way to engage in a war. So the medieval time is oftentimes defined by its feudal system, and in the feudal system, landowners owning land and being a lord over a area are carried with it the responsibility to provide fighting men to the king if he so required it or requested it. And this timeline, in this era of the medieval world, there was no great international court by which to make evaluations on whether or not this or that kingdom was committing war crimes. In fact, the way that people thought about war and warfare was very different than the way that we like to depict in some films. There was distinction between fighters and non-combatants, but it was much more fluid. There was a challenge, a very ethical challenge to be made and understood about who was fighting who and to what extent. So to think that a knight had a code of honor was a good example of what might look like a culturally enforced or suggested proto example of the rules of engagement. And this is glorified, encouraged, and even respected in our contemporary time as we honor that tradition of the idea of a knight, a man who is upstanding in both moral character and physical capability, who then goes forth into war with courage and honor for the sake of whatever it is that he's supposed to be fighting for, whether it is to save the princess, kill the dragon, fight the barbarians, or whatever. Right? You can insert your amount of mythology, but the challenge that we understand is that in the pre-Enlightenment era, warfare was generally waged on a total scale. That means if you were to go fight the men of a population, then you would have no laborers. And so the entire community was involved in the war because there was sieges and castles and the destruction of property. But this is also in some cases made a little bit hyperbolic by the way that media presents it. Still, before the Enlightenment era, rules of engagement were not the same thing as what we look at them now. In fact, to apply modern sensibilities or modern perspectives of warfare and apply that morality to the warfare in the past would not only be anachronistic, but it would be a bit of chronological snobbery, to once again refer to C.S. Lewis, one of our favorite authors here. And chronological snobbery is something as simple as thinking that because we have more technology, we are smarter and better off than any other generation that ever lived. And a small amount of reading of, say, like Athanasius or even Anselm or any of the big A's would frighteningly remind us that that is not the case. We might have exchanged philosophy for technology, but that does not wiser make us. We have much to learn from the past. And so, what I'm saying here and what I'm drawing about in this historical timeline is that there was a time before we had our distinction between regular and irregular warfare. Even the Romans knew that there was a difference between their regulars and their irregular forces. And there was a difference between defeating an opposing army and subjugating a population. So, what do we see here? We see that it throughout time and throughout as the technology that is involved in war fighting has advanced, there has been a concerted or a concerned effort, not always the same thing, not the same thing in this case at all. There is a concerned effort to limit the scale of war because when it comes to things like the nuclear bomb, which again, America is no saint in the matter, when it comes to things like the nuclear bomb or chemical warfare or the atrocities and the not even the atrocities, the scale of industrial warfare, Before we hit the industrial age, there were even attempts in Europe to limit the scale of war. Now, you can think of this in a very simple way. And I don't mean simple as an insulting, I mean simple as it's straightforward. If I were to go to war against, if my people go to war against another people, and let's just say that war is justified for whatever reason, and both of us somehow have a conveniently justified conflict between each other, and I am willing to go so far as to destroy even the way of life of those people, then am I not giving that next generation cause to continue in warfare? If I start, or if I am attacked and I react, if I react to a fight in a way that is not proportionate to the response, am I not setting myself up for future challenges, future government issues? And it would be very convenient if those who sat in seats of power and held the reins of the military were to have some sort of cognition in understanding that reality in our war. But instead, they've bureaucratized it into something else. We call this the rules of engagement. So there was a time in the 1800s that von Claus, or not the 1800s, but there was a time, Napoleon 1800s, correct, where von Clausewitz in his book on war is struggling with something that he calls the distinction between true war and real war. And the hard part of that distinction, we've started talking about it quite a bit, right, quite a bit lately, is that true war is what we would idealize as a gentleman's war. And this idea, the concept of the gentleman's war, this limited warfare where you only engage in specific military targets, and people play this sort of complicated version of chess, but it's not even chess itself, to attempt to outmaneuver and subdue each other's militaries without producing excessive damage to the casualties around it, the collateral, as we refer to it in our day. And this idea, this set of values, was in many ways born out of the European Enlightenment. Whether or not they followed along with it is another story. And so from this idea, this sort of justice, international justice system, we've built up to things like the Geneva Convention. We've seen this construction, the extension of this idea build into a world where you have soldiers and you have non-combatants. You have fighters and you have, again, non-combatants. You have fighters and the innocent. For some reason, people who support war, or not support like a pundit, because pundits don't, saying pundits support war is such a kind of a short-sighted perspective. It's it's more it's more about how, I mean, pundits could probably be put into the category of propaganda, but it's something much more like the families and the financial systems which make war possible by an adversary are those considered legitimate targets. But this distinction continued to grow, and what we saw, we instead of getting bogged down today, or instead of focusing on the what it, or not only what it looked like, we should look at the cultural elements. In a pre-modern time, since a soldier, I'm sorry, in a pre-modern time, most wars were fought by a series of something like conscripts or serfs being led by a noble, a lord, a leader, a general, or of some sort. In you saw the rise of professional armies as somewhat of a counter to this. Even Keegan refers to some of the challenges that von Clausewitz's generation had faced with the production of, or the generation prior to von Clausewitz, of producing regiments, and the idea of the regiments were born out of creating professional soldiers so that people, when they were no longer needed to fight, wouldn't just turn to banditry. And so you have this distinction within von Clausewitz between true war and real war, and you have this distinction in history between this idea of total war and limited warfare, or unlimited and limited warfare. And in that pre-modern time, pre-modern meaning medieval, pre-Renaissance era, or pre-Enlightenment era is probably the better, more specific term. What we see in warfare is oftentimes a very limited amount of professional soldiers. In fact, and evidence for this is that anytime we have seen some form of professional standing army, be they janissaries, be they whatever, janissaries, be they samurai, be they any form of named people, not even just the Spartans, but like the hoplites and these different terms, they're given that distinction because of how different they are from everything else at the time. Anybody who is historically are defined and cast in this sense and described as a standing army or a specifically trained army is not as much the norm as the exception, or that is a position. And so even a long time ago there was a distinction between the civilian and the military. But how does that change over time? So if before if in the pre-enlightenment era, in the pre-enlightenment time, there were people and then there were knights, or there were people and there were lords, and there were people and there were sort of this, there was this distinction between the serfs and the fighters on the ground and these specifically designated leaders and warriors of some sort. Now that distinction is, it has struggles when we get into the time of the Napoleonic Wars, because simply being a lord does not a great general make thee. And Napoleon recognized this and as his armies were expanding, and he recognized this in the development of the NCO, the non-commissioned officer. And what you saw in the Enlightenment era was a distinct shift within professional militaries, because professional militaries were starting to rise at the beginning of the Enlightenment era out of recognition of establishing a national identity in certain places, as well as a concern by governments to not essentially turn their prior indentured fighters into bandits robbing their own coffers while they speak. And so this challenge grows, and then you have the balance of power, and the balance of power tries to limit the scale of warfare to combatants. The balance of power taking place in Europe. The balance of power is a European concept that came out of the Enlightenment era, where people recognized that the governments were trying to essentially jockey and balance power throughout the European continent so that no one empire, no one country gained supremacy over all the others. And so or countries, kingdoms even, would build treaties between each other so that they would keep each other in check. Napoleon clearly challenged this issue. And so Napoleon recognized that it was not aristocracy but merit that should lead to a soldier's promotion. And what happened right before this time, right before Napoleon, was a similar occurrence in America, as the Rangers, what would eventually the Rangers be titled after, but the Rangers were dealing with the issue of the regulars. Before there was the Civil War, or even during that time, American as well as British colonial conflicts had to struggle very realistically with the fact that the irregular American self-trained man was oftentimes more capable than the than the British trained and equipped regular. Turns out, if you sua sponte, if you do it of your own accord, that a better soldier makes. So how does this apply going forward? Or how does this apply in our storyline? The narrative that I am trying to describe, and the narrative that I'm presenting to you, is that there was a time before the aggressive distinction that we've made in the rules of engagement. There was a time before the way that we think of uh, combatants and non-combatants, limited versus total war, and even our most stout convictions to the distinction between combatants and the so-called innocent gets challenged under dire situations. Sherman's March to the Sea is a perfect example. When we have to commit atrocities, it is for our survival, but when our enemies commit atrocities, it is because they're bad people. This is a challenge that all countries, armies, and warfighters have to face. And the story that as I'm presenting it to you begins in this sort of pre-modern era, almost the medieval era, and it changes and it evolves through the Enlightenment era. But instead of thinking of it as what we live in as the postmodern era, we are shifting from a centralized, organized environment, which is what a lot of the Enlightenment ultimately produced, even though it was trying to fight against. And it it changed the because I mean, what did we get out of it? NATO. We got the Geneva Convention. What we recognize is that in the pre-medieval world, or the pre-modern world, the pre-enlightenment world, there was a lot of gray areas between people's operations and how they functioned. But then the Enlightenment centralized a lot of that through the translation of information, and now we're in the post-information age, and we're in the post-modern era. And there's a phrase at the end of the introduction of this book in A History of Warfare that I want to read to you. Soldiers are not as other men. That is the lesson I have learned from a life cast among warriors. The lesson has taught me to view with extreme suspicion all theories and representations of war, that it equate it with any other activity of human affairs. War undoubtedly connects, as the theorist demonstrates, with economics and diplomacy and politics. Connection does not amount to identity or even to similarity. War is wholly unlike diplomacy or politics because it must be fought by men whose values and skills are not those of politicians and diplomats. They are those of a world apart, a very ancient world, which exists in parallel with the everyday world, but does not belong to it. Both worlds change over time, and the warrior would adapt in step to the civilian, and the warrior world adapts in step to the civilian. It follows it, however, at a distance. The distance can never be closed, for the culture of the warrior can never be that of civilization itself. All civilizations owe their origins to the warrior, their cultures nurture the warriors who defend them, and the differences between them will make those of one very different in externals from those of another. It is indeed a theme of this book that in externals there are three distinct warrior traditions. Ultimately, however, there is only one warrior culture. Its evolution and transformation over time and place from man's beginning to his arrival in the contemporary world is the history of warfare. So again, I would endorse reading this book if you have the opportunity, but this is the ending of the narrative. This idea of formalized warfare, standing armies, and the distinction between the warrior and the civilian is now getting old. It is falling apart. It is breaking to pieces. It is unable to carry the weight of a decentralizing world. We have seen culture, in a sense, we've seen culture reject a centralization. We've moved away from monarchy, sort of, and then we've tried to pursue something like a constitutional republic, or in some people's verbiage, a democracy. But we've also seen that the world has gone from serfs and conscripts led by lords to standing armies led by generals, now to the world that we live in today. And the line that stood out in that conclusion, that in that last paragraph, is that soldiers are not as other men. The author earlier on in the book is confessing about how he was unable to fight in World War II, even though his father fought in World War I. The author of the book was unable to fight in World War II because he had a deficiency. One of his legs was broken or shorter than the other. I can't remember what it was. But he had some sort of physical disability that prevented him from military service during World War II. And as a result, he went on to his education and then followed through to working within the the academics of war, especially in a British environment. And he goes on to say in that conclusion that soldiers are not like other men. And on the one hand, that distinction for him was very easy. The distinction between a warrior and a non warrior was much more easily understood in the time of World War II, where the warriors went off to war and there wasn't just a small batch of them. And those who were not of the warrior class stayed behind. But today, 2023 into 2024, that line of distinction is not so solid anymore. We have seen the return of the rise of insurgency. We have seen the return of guerrilla warfare as a common form of revolution. We have seen so many things change, whether warfare is waged informationally, propagandistically, or through economics. And so what we are learning, and what gun culture is at the forefront of our communities in our world in, is that gun culture is quite potentially the first peoples, the first persons within our contemporary world to recognize that that harsh distinction between the warrior and the civilian is falling away. It's antiquated. It's Napoleonic, and it's not even neoclassical. It is from a bygone era. Now, whether we are talking about Israel and Gaza and the formal armies of, or the formal military of Israel being expected to uphold a certain standard that the freedom fighters or terrorists of Gaza or the Palestinians are not, we see an asymmetry. But that asymmetry only exists because one half of the equation is being held to a standard that the other half is not. In fact, you see in American culture a continuous reprisal of this. The Antifa peoples are allowed or permitted or given a certain permission to engage in irregular forms of warfare, but their opposition is not. They are purposely taking advantage of the rules of engagement of their opponents. And so, ideologically, militaristically, and individually, we are watching that timeline change. Are we becoming more of a feudalistic society? Is the world shifting from nation states to corporate entities? Are we seeing the rise of PMCs to be the permanent future, or the near permanent future, or the next phase of human evolution of war? Are we going to see the standing armies of Google fight against the CCP? I mean, that's a joke, but you get the point. No, maybe, probably not that equation. But what we recognize is as we draw that line, or as we see that line disappear between the warrior and the civilian, it is the civilian's responsibility to consider the rules of engagement that they will be facing. We saw this on the battlefield. I observed this as a ranger, and this is that those of us who are on the ground making decisions, those of us who are on the mission holding the rifle, looking at the woman holding her child, and the squalor or the wealth of the homes that we broke into or that we entered into looking for targets particularly very often a Haqqani network or Al Qaeda related or Al Qaeda themselves. We recognize, or even Taliban, we recognized, and what we saw is that those of us who were on the ground, those of us who had to see the evil with our eyes, were infinitely better equipped than those who were writing the rules of engagement to understand what was going on around us. But we lived in an antiquated society where the rules of engagement and the bureaucracy was being written. I'm sorry, the rules of engagement would be written by a bureaucracy that had no skin in the game. That same metaphor, that same example applies to you and me today. If you are going to carry a firearm, if you are going to concern yourselves with the well being of your family, and you do not consider with great seriousness what the rules of engagement are, and you do not consider the moral implications of what you're doing, and you do not consider the foundation upon which that morality is grounded, then not only will you be easy to manipulate by your intellectual and your intellectual opponents, so to speak, you'll not only will you be easily manipulated by your enemies, but you will also find yourselves on the rocks of a moral aberration. So, in summary, we're in summary of today's episodes, we're going to go into a deeper argument on ethics versus like choose building an army on ethics versus building an army on with the goal of pure victory in the future. But today, I wanted to paint you a narrative that in the old world there was less of a distinction between legitimate and illegitimate targets, and the distinction between fighters or warriors per se and non-combatants was quite broad. It changed from people to people, kingdom to kingdom, nation to nation, if that's what you want to use. But there was quite a bit of variation. However, the distinction between a standing army and that it being a warrior class and the civilian population rose through the Enlightenment era, culminating in World War II. But that time is now the past. We are watching the distinction between the warrior and the civilian diminish over the years. And with that comes our individual responsibility. If we were going to argue for the decentralization of a population, if we are going to argue for individual liberty, we must willingly and voluntarily bear the moral responsibilities of that decision. We must choose which is moral, because it will not be told to us. We must pursue that which we understand to be moral, because we will be judged by it. And if we are going to call ourselves free men, then we better act like it. So, if you have enjoyed this episode of the Redacted Culture Cast, I ask that you share this episode with somebody else. Growth is very, very, very difficult to achieve at these early stages, but we are thankful for every opportunity we get to spread the word. And if this has changed your mentality, your paradigm of sorts on how you understand our timeline in war, go ahead and leave a comment or help us out. Whatever you want to do to, as they say, appease the YouTube or the social media gods. But if you share this, we thank you. If you want to support us, head over to redactedllc.com or redactedculture.locals.com, where all of the parts that we can't put on social media go. Well, we can, but it's not really worth it all the time. So if that's where you want to join us, we will see you there soon. Again, that is redactedllc.com and redactedculture.locals.com. For that, if you want to look at, if you need it spelled out, they should be in the link below or in the description. And again, thank you for your time. But remember, if we are going to consider there to be no distinction between the warrior and the civilian or the citizen, then we must recognize that the citizen has a responsibility to bear that was once cast and left on only the shoulders of the warfighter. That being the case, go forth and conquer.